Welcome to Open
Theism.
Welcome to Open Theism. Welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher, and today I got the eminent Doctor of Physics, physicist John Fisher, here with me. Doctorate.
Yep, Doctorate of Metaphysics.
So tell everyone your qualifications.
For physics?
For physics. What's your doctorate in?
I got a bachelor's degree in physics, a master's degree in biomedical engineering, and a doctorate in nanoscience and nanotechnology. So
this is Doctor of Science we have here. And what was your thesis paper on?
Multiphoton imaging.
Yeah, multiphoton imaging. So we got the real deal here. So today we're going to talk about physics with a physicist, a doctor of physics. And see if physics is that a real thing. We're actually going to talk about how do we know anything. And I'd like to pull up for conversation this book, I Am Strange Loop. I've probably mentioned it a couple times on the podcast. And basically his contention is that everything that goes on in our mind is inherently self-referential. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a profound book because it sort of gives context to the idea of what identity is. What is a person? What are you when you think about yourself? Like, for instance, so every time you think about yourself, you think about, this is my hand, this is my foot, this is my desires, this is my ideas. And he asked the question, every time you say that, what is the actual my behind that? Behind that identity, like will if you start stripping all of those things away, will there still be something there at the end of it? And Hofstadter is interesting because his contention is that it's actually more of a self-referential situation where you're referencing all those other attributes about yourself in reference to these other things. So when you say my hand, my soul, my thoughts, it's in reference to the totality of who you are, as opposed to some sort of like kernel that is non-existent, some floating entity outside of all that.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting, this whole self-referential thing, because typically we would think of something that's self-referential as inherently contradictory. You don't define a word using the word itself, but if you look at the dictionary as a whole, every single word in the dictionary loops around eventually. Outside of the dictionary, there's no link to the real world. You have to bring in your assumptions in the dictionary in order to make it make sense, because it's all self-referential inherently. And that's typically how we experience the world around us. We talked a little bit about the TED video about how optical illusions work and how your mind can be tricked into seeing different colors based on context. In one context, the exact same color might be purple. In another context, it might be yellow. We are inherently contextual creatures, and we understand things from accumulating and understanding data in context of other data. No data point stands alone.
Yeah, that's right. And so people get this idea that you could just sort of intuit, internalize everything that from nothingness. Descartes is actually famous for sort of broaching this idea with his famous "I think, therefore I am," which itself is a very funny idea because when you say "I think, therefore I am," you're already postulating there's an I there thinking, therefore you are. And so it's already in this context of kind of self-referential where you're assuming the thing that you're trying to prove in the first place. And Descartes' entire vision when he's trying to make this case, I don't know if everyone knows the phrase "I think, therefore I am," but people who've actually read his work on it, he's deliberately trying to isolate himself from all other inferences that you can come up with, any sort of like physical references, the ideas that you see, the world around him. He says can all be a trick. How do I know apart from these things what I am? And he's trying to come up with an existence and a first principle outside of all these other reference points. And I think you already see even in his own declaration, the problem with that idea is that he still has to assume he exists to prove that he exists. And so it ends up becoming, despite all of these trying filtering away the problems, it still is ultimately a self-referential project.
It is so interesting. So you watch little kids develop. They start out as little babies, and they kind of they're thrust into this world that they don't understand, they don't know, and they can't quite process everything. And they start piecing together things as they occur. They're putting together pieces, and then you see the little kids then start to mimic you through their life as they gain context for the data that they've inputted. They understand how things are supposed to function, and they'll do this cargo cult thing. A cargo cult is this concept of when in World War II, when we were landing planes in a lot of these islands, all these tribal peoples would see us radioing the towers, and a cargo plane would land, and all the cargo would be offloaded. And they believed that we were like praying to gods. And so once we left the island, these cults would form and try to mimic those radio tower signals to try to get the cargo planes to land. So it's mimicking without understanding. And that's basically what our kids do for the first part of their life, just trying to piece together how things are supposed to operate. My little daughter says, "Oh, that's a phone. I'm supposed to hold it to my face like this. I'm supposed to talk into it." Because contextually, she's seen other people doing that. She doesn't understand the purpose and function between it, but that's just her putting together the data that she's accumulated thus far.
Yeah, that's right. That's cargo cultures. They were building airstrips and all sorts of things, and it just didn't lead to anything because it came without understanding. But it's an interesting idea because you need to begin somewhere. These people didn't know what the reason was, and nobody seemed to explain it to them in a way that would actually matter. And so they're trying. This is sort of like the beginning stages of learning to find out what exactly do you have to do. And this is probably one of the reasons you would see in ancient cultures all kinds of things, like they would think you would have to pray a certain way or the gods would be angry, and they would start trying to relate events in their own lives to what happened with the weather or with the storms or with just pestilence and disasters of all sorts. They're operating under these basic these basic cause and effect relationships that you're trying to piece out, but it doesn't necessarily come all together. It's not like you developed it from nothing. You have to operate from that mentality because you don't have anything else to go off of starting out.
So I guess our next question is, we talked a little bit about how human beings process and understand information. Nothing is a matter of fact itself. All the data that we've gathered, it's all contextual, all has to be interpreted per user. There's no one thing that you can say this is a de facto truth, and there's no alternative explanation for this data. I guess that leads us to question, what is the fundamental building blocks of the universe? And I posted a physics video in which a physicist said, fundamentally, we still don't understand the basic operation and function of the universe. We don't know what makes it all work. What down to the smallest particles, what is it fundamentally?
Yeah, I don't know the video you posted, but what physicists work with right now is what's called the Standard Model, and it's a model of fields, and all particles are essentially thought of in terms of quantum field theory, and so everything's just sort of clustered into certain sort of groups and categories. But one of the driving forces for string theory is to even harmonize that even closer together, because instead of having a bunch of fundamental particles, you would want to have just a few certain algorithms and procedures that you can run as a way to predict that everything else has occurred. And that's one of the driving forces. It's kind of a mathematical driven physics problem where they just want to make everything as simple as humanly possible. I don't know the video you specifically mentioned, but there is, even though physicists love things like simplicity and beauty and that sort of thing, there actually is no fundamental reason that the Standard Model can't be all there is. It's just that it's not as satisfying as it would otherwise be.
Right. So fundamentally, like I'll think back to high school class. I had a science teacher, and he said this. He said, the Greeks, they used to believe that there were 4 elements or 4 atoms that made up all things. There was fire, water, earth, wind, and they believed that these atoms were the smallest particles. They were wrong. There are smaller particles. There's neurons, protons, and electrons.
Neutrons.
There's neutrons, protons, and electrons. His fundamental error was a conflation of terms. Yeah. It could turn out in all reality, maybe there are these four underlying elements that make up all of reality. We just don't know fundamentally what matter is and how it functions. So when people ask me if I'm a physicalist, all that exists is the physical, we don't even know fundamentally
what that means.
What is matter? What is atoms?
A big part of the problem of not knowing fundamentally is that it has to be contextualized by the other things that you see. And so matter can only be contextualized by different concepts within matter. And that's why you have this problem, and I call it the infinite why, where you can literally just start asking why for everything. You have a little kid, and the kid says, "Why is the sky blue?" And you tell them, and they say, "Why is that?" And they say, "Why?" And the reason for that is that the question why, if you think in more mathematical terms, the question why is just an operator that you can start applying to anything, and it's sort of infinitely derivatable. And there's really only two ways in principle that this question can ever meaningfully be resolved. One is that the answer is itself, or two is that the answer is nothing. Otherwise, it will go on forever. So those are your three possibilities. When you start trying to piece together at the deepest sense of what things are, you can already sort of predict what the answer could possibly look like. Either there is no answer, or the answer is zero, whatever that would be. There would be that the questions can just go on forever and ever, or there's a loop. It becomes self-referential. And that's kind of this idea with bringing up I Am a Strange Loop in the first place, is that everything is sort of ends up ultimately being self-referential in some way.
Yeah, so this model of the world where everything is self-referential, we're operating in this kind of quasi-spectrum where we don't actually have absolutes. All we have is interpretation of raw data. This would kind of go against models of the world which de facto claim there's a physical world and there's a spiritual world. And so some Christians will say, oh, the physical world is definitely not the spiritual world. Well, what kind of assumptions are you bringing into that? You're bringing in a worldview that is not germane to even the ancient Hebrew worldview, and it's not at the face value. What am I looking for? It's not necessary. It's not
the idea. The word supernatural is itself just a sort of modern artificial construction as a way to try to start distinguishing between collections of ideas, but it's kind of an interesting idea in the sense that if you're more of a materialist, then you start deliberately defining supernatural as anything that you've ever been able to produce evidence for, which is not necessarily the concept that you would want to look at if you're trying to talk about whether there's a God or not, whether the Bible is true. Because what I was thinking would be a good example of this, actually, is feeding the 5,000. So say you're one of the 5,000 and you're getting fed by these fish, right? And so typically what they say is that some supernatural act is happening where you're holding a piece of bread and you're pulling on it and there's more and more bread that's coming out. But if you try to actually think logistically how this sort of thing happens, what you're going to see is in some way there would be more bread materializing as you start feeding yourself. And so the question is, like, when you're watching this, at what point is that supernatural and what point is that natural, and how would you define where that division between supernatural and is? You're sitting there watching it, and if you're a scientist trying to think about this in terms of a scientific mind, your immediate reaction is not going to be that can't happen. It's going to be that's cool. How did that happen? Because in fact, what that seems to violate just on the surface level is the idea of the conservation of mass and energy, which is the fundamental logic behind all of physics. If that is violated, then all of physics would be violated. And so you wouldn't actually come from an attitude, well, physics is all wrong, physics has been violated, and now supernaturalism is complete poppycock. What you would think instead is, there's other dimensions to reality that I have yet to consider and that I need to incorporate into my understanding of things like the conservation of mass and energy.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on. Let's start talking about space and time. And so, does space exist?
Yeah? What do you mean?
Well, does time exist? Or are they conceptualization devices?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, but if you're just saying that language is a symbolic thing and that it's something different than the reality around it, that's probably true. That's one of the problems people have. Do you mean, does the concept of time exist? I need to understand your question a little
So
better.
let's say you're in a video game and it's Minecraft and you have a pedometer that shows how long you've walked and you walk a mile. Well, we know that a computer is just ones and zeros. We just experienced a 3D representation of walking a mile. That mile doesn't actually exist. It only exists by virtue of something that we can conceptualize onto this video game to make sense of what's going on in the video game.
Okay, so the mile does exist, though. It does exist
in some sense
in the context of its video. But even like when you think of physics, there's certain papers, for instance, that say actually all of 3D reality can be projected onto a 2D dimensional world, and so in that sense, it's entirely conceivable that we ourselves are all holograms of a 2D world that doesn't actually exist in that way. So it seems to me that what you're really asking is, are we appropriately interpreting our experiences as the only meaningful manifestation of that reality? I think another way of saying it, why you're saying that walking a mile in a video game is something that is real in one context and not real in the other, but in fact it's real in every context. The things are equivalent. It's just that we've misinterpreted or overestimated what the one reality is, when in fact that they're equivalent ideas. And as long as they're equivalent ideas, they're as real as each other. It's just that you haven't pieced together in what way they are real.
And so would it be a mistake to say walking a mile in real life is real, and then walking a mile in a video game is fake?
Well, so this is why talking about the language is such a confusing thing, because what you're actually saying is that when you define a mile in real life and then define it in the video game, the actual definitions of those miles are different depending on what you're saying. Because the definition of what space is and what distance is and what motion is and even possibly what time is somewhat different depending on whether you're talking about that and the other context. And so you run into this problem all the time where the language isn't necessarily capable of describing meaningfully the actual physical results. This is not something esoteric in the sense that it's irrelevant. This is actually the fundamental problem of quantum mechanics, where, there's a famous quote, I think it was Richard Feynman, who said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. And the idea is that you can't actually conceptualize quantum mechanics in any language other than the math. The math is the only way to describe it, because everything else, every time you try to make some sort of more meaningful model in your head compared to what quantum mechanics does, it breaks down. It fails in significant ways. So if you understand quantum mechanics simply through the language of the mathematics that describe it, then sure, you understand quantum mechanics, but you never will be able to personally intuit it, because your mind will not interpret reality along those parameters.
Mm-hmm. So the practical difference between, let's say I have a waking dream or a dream where I experience everything that's going on as if it was real life, you can't draw a distinct difference between me running a mile in a dream and me running a mile in real life, except for in context. But my experience could be the exact same. There's no certain way to tell the difference between the two. And so that brings me to a different conversation I was having with an atheist. And he said to me, if there's multiple models of explaining the same phenomena, they're equally as likely. So, for example, this is what I threw out there. So say you're reading a book. Well, maybe there's lights that are reflecting off pages, and the pages have printed text, and they're reflecting to your eyes. Or maybe there's an alien in orbit. I'm reading an entirely different book, and he's intercepting those light signals, and he's reflecting brand new light signals to my eyes. Are those equally as likely?
Well, that whole concept is absurd, and if you actually lived by that, you wouldn't believe in anything at any time in any way. Because you can literally endlessly create infinite number of models, and they can be as bizarre as humanly possible. What the normal standard tends to be is that you try to make things as simple as possible, and that you try to build models of the world that incorporate all the details while still being less without any unnecessary baggage.
So it's more likely, this was my argument, it's more likely that I'm living a real existence than I'm living in some matrix generated world and I'm really connected to some sort of matrix pod somewhere. It's more likely that my default experience is probably going to be more true than that.
So this is a funny thing to bring up, because this is people talk about Sam Harris, and Elon Musk famously talked about this too. I think the official name is the simulation theory. I'm not sure, but the idea is simply that because simulations are very, very easy to make, you can make in principle as many as imaginable. So many different sort of simulations of reality, that the likelihood that you're in the real world versus the simulation is so low that you're probably in the simulation. And Elon Musk, I don't know if he's just trying to be edgy, but he says he believes it. I think
Scott Adams says he believes the simulation model.
I don't know if Sam Harris does or not, but I know he doesn't think it's a bad idea. But I think it's ridiculous. I think that it's essentially the God of the Gaps argument inverted. Which is the problem with the God of the Gaps argument that atheists will point out is when people start talking about the universe and its structure and function, they say, look at how amazingly fine-tuned the universe is. Therefore, the probability that the universe all came together by chance is so low that it's an impossible thing to have happened, right? And so what they're just trying to do is come up with probabilities, right? They say the probability of this is so low that's impossible for this to happen. With the simulation theory, it's utterly inverted. It's the idea that there are so many other alternatives to what we actually think the world is operating like, that therefore the specific one that you're dealing with is so unlikely that you shouldn't believe it. It's the same idea. And it has the same inherent problems, which is that you don't have enough information to even know the probabilities of these things. You don't know that a simulation is likely or unlikely. You don't know about how likely it is for the world to exist in the way it is compared to all the other ones. What you actually have to be able to do is describe all the different ways that the world can actually exist, not hypothetically in your mind, actually exist, to be able to establish probabilities. And so you can't actually function along those lines unless you had a very good way of understanding all those. And it's not effective for helping you navigate the world to postulate those infinite probabilities of things that you can't even conceive of.
Yeah, so that was basically my argument to this atheist. I said, well, I look at the data and I try to come up with the best explanation of the data. And just because alternate solutions to the data exist, that doesn't make them equally as likely. I'm going to default with my lived experience. Mm-hmm. And so my lived experience was my argument, and he was rejecting my lived experience as if he's going to override my lived experience. And I'm going to convert to his view and say, oh, all my lived experience, I don't care about that. For example, we were talking about time. My lived experience is that the present is real, the past no longer exists, and the future is not a thing. And presentism, that all that exists is now, because I don't have access, and I don't know how someone would show anyone having access to the present or future in such a way that would differentiate it from presentism, that all that exists is now.
Right. Even all the physics descriptions of how to get into the past, based on relativistic thinking, they all involve basically fundamentally violating conservation of mass and energy, because it requires things like going at an infinite speed or with an infinite mass, things like that, where you already see in the physics that physics is telling you such a thing as going back in time is impossible in any meaningful sense, unless you just sort of throw out the idea that you can somehow travel at an infinite speed. And so when they come up with these ideas, they're already demonstrating to you such a thing. Time certainly is relative in the sense that some person can experience time in a lot faster way than someone else, but there's a clear and well-defined arrow of time that says you're always going forward, and everyone at all times is all together in this present moment. The relativity never changes the fact that the present moment is always now.
Always now, yeah. It'd be really hard to counter this or show that this is false. You'd have to have some sort of. I know they've done some quantum experiences where they only that the state of particles changes based on observation, and they don't reveal the state of observation until afterwards. But
so even that is people don't understand what that means when they say that, because they don't mean a person observing it. They really mean
a method of observation.
You have an electron and it's probed by a photon, and the photon is the observer, which changes the state. So there's a lot of misunderstandings when people even say things like observer, because what a scientist means is not what the random person thinks when they want to come up with some new age philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the experiment I saw took photons, and they were sending them through these different gates.
The double slit experiment.
Well, but it was like multiple double slits, and so when it split off to start a second series, that's where the observer was stationed, and that affected photons on that different branch.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if that's the case, that doesn't prove that time travel is real. That just proves that there's some sort of mechanism that causes this certain pattern based on the current state of the world.
Yeah, I think I have a sense of what you're talking about, and that's just that somehow the photons, when they're you're splitting them off with a beam splitter, somehow they seem to know what they're going to hit before they hit it, and they'll change their behavior before that happens. And then it's in a weird way. It's not something that, like, I've read about. It's really weird stuff. It's not. It has nothing to do with. No one really proposes that it's actually there. It's experiencing stuff. That time has somehow been violated because of that, and it's predicted based on the quantum mechanics. If you look at it in terms of just the equations. But it's not something that says that somehow there is no such thing as time, because that would actually be coming up with a mechanism that isn't what quantum mechanics is telling you. That's in fact coming up with those explanations is what I mean, which is when I say that quantum mechanics defies our intuitions. Every time you try to come up with those models, they're meaningful and testable, and you can test to prove that those aren't actually what's going on. So yeah, so it's somewhat annoying that people try to use quantum mechanics and or relativity or any kind of physics to justify some of the bizarre ideas they have, because usually they don't even understand what the experiment was doing, and so try to minimize that. Even I should probably minimize that.
Yeah, this speculation. This experiment proved this. Now time is no more and doesn't exist. It's like, okay, now you got all this reverse causation going on. It just all doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. That's probably why my favorite time travel movie is 12 Monkeys, is because it's a closed loop. It's all fated. Mm-hmm. There's no free will. Everything must happen according to what has already been set from time eternal. That's the only way this type of theory actually works in practice. Not necessarily with the physics, but in reverse causation. That's the only way you solve it.
Right. It basically, the idea of 12 Monkeys is that, at least the thing that you would intuit from that is that somehow the entire narrative of history has to be pre-scripted. That's kind of a funny thing, especially when you're thinking about open theism, is that if something from the future affected the past in a closed loop form, then it's only because it was already pre-scripted to happen that way.
All right, absolutely. Okay, so we're going on about 30 minutes. This is a pretty fast and dirty physicist with my doctor friend,
dirty.
Dr. Fisher. I'm also a doctor. I got my doctorate of theology, kind of.
Well, you got one in metaphysics for $30, right?
Well, no, not in metaphysics. I got one in theology. It's an honorary theology physics doctorate degree. So 2 doctors having a discussion about physics with physicist Jonathan Fisher. And so we talked about how we know anything. We know things contextually. We don't know things in and of themselves. All the data that we have to piece together and try to understand in context. Even something as simple as colors is based on contextual surrounding. There's no object in and of themselves that we have access to. Everything is a closed loop in our lives, in the dictionary, and how we understand things. Let's see, how do we know anything fundamentally about the universe? We don't fundamentally know the basic building blocks of the universe. We just don't know how it functions and operates. We have to try to understand the data that we have available. One thing we didn't talk about was how, not knowing these smaller aspects, I don't have to know how a car engine works. I don't have to know how the engine functions and the gas explodes in order for me to jump in my car and drive down to Walmart. It's irrelevant to my day-to-day lifestyle. And so not understanding the basic building blocks of the universe, the basic particles of physics, that has no effect on my daily life because I operate at a meta level. I don't operate at that sub level. And as long as the sub level is predictable in some fashion, all the gas molecules in the I Am Strange loop, he uses the example of an engine, all the gas molecules exploding, expanding. Some go down, some go up, but the aggregate pushes that cylinder up so that the motor runs. As long as they're predictable on aggregate in some sort of way that reoccurs, I can live my life without any knowledge of how these sub-processes work.
This is actually one of the interesting things when you look at relativity, when you try to understand relativistic equations. What actually happens when you look at the relativistic equations is that as long as you're looking within the regime common to human experience in terms of speeds and mass, the relativistic equations turn into F equals ma. And so what it's telling you is that F equals ma is just kind of like an incomplete description of the broader picture, but it's very accurate and useful within everything that you need to use for your daily life. And so, if you're going to ask a philosopher a question, is the equation F equals ma, is that true or is that false? And the physicist will probably say that's true, F equals ma, and the philosopher will say it's false because obviously relativity shows that F doesn't equal ma, and all you have to do is get to high speeds to get there. But physicists don't care. They're just trying to look at how this thing applies in the context of the question that they're asking. And so if they're asking a question like, how do we get to the moon? People, as a number of you know, we got to the moon on F equals ma. If they're asking how do you get GPS to be very accurate, then you need the relativistic equations. But one thing comes from the other. And so you could in fact start interpreting our broader understanding of the world as a way of piecing things together slowly and surely by adding to the concepts after we figure things out. We know what our daily experience is like, and then we add to that when we get new information that incorporates that. That addition, though, does not invalidate the original thing. In fact, the only way to add is to have your new explanation incorporate the old data.
All right, so fundamentally, I don't need to know how quantum physics works. My life operates with pretty regular occurrences that are predictable, and I'm able to function in my day-to-day life without any knowledge of these subsystems. And they could occur, and they could occur randomly. There's a lot of talk about randomness and particles. As long as they operate with some consistency, my life can go on in a meaningful way without any knowledge whatsoever about the fundamental nature of reality. That's irrelevant to my day-to-day life.
Yeah. Everyone's computer has transistors in it. and your transistors operate through quantum mechanics, because what happens is that you have a certain probability that your electron is going to tunnel through an energy wall to go through the transistor, and that's how you gate the information. That's a probability distribution, and the reason that people would talk about quantum mechanics as being a probability where there's inherent randomness in the system, but as long as you're using large scale numbers like billions of electrons, it doesn't really matter, because those things become so highly probable that you can still operate your very computers on this logic. So what ends up happening is that you don't really need to understand quantum mechanics, because there's an inherent structure. Despite the fact that randomness exists, the world is biased towards a certain result. You will get that result, and in terms of as soon as you get to the size of you and I, that result is so ridiculously predictable that you can base your entire reality, which you can expect the sun to come up the next day, you can expect to wake up the next day, as long as you ate right.
Yeah, absolutely. So space, time, all of these concepts are relative to our experience. We might experience space differently in our dreams, or space differently in a video game, and space differently in real world. When people get criticized for maybe not believing in a spiritual world, well, what is a spiritual world?
Right.
And how do you know exactly that this thing exists in the way that you're saying? And how is this not part of the quote-unquote physical world? We don't know what physics are.
Right. The problem with creating an arbitrary line between spiritual and physical is that you have to have a meaningful definition of what is spiritual, supernatural, that sort of thing. I think one of the problems that what people have when they start defining these things is that the definition is a definition of negation, that it's defined as not being physical, and therefore no matter what you do to describe something, it's therefore not considered part of that world. And that's nonsense. Like, you're never going to get it. It's intentionally designed so that you can never come up with a meaningful explanation behind what happens.
I guess in one sense, that's how all language works, that you're not going to have a super specific definition. They're just generalizations. I think we use a cat in one of my previous episodes. What is a cat? And, is a robot cat a cat? Is a cat, maybe a cat's defined as a mammal with 4 legs. What about one of those hairless cats? So what if it was born with 3 legs? Maybe is born with cat's Down syndrome, missing some chromosomes that cats normal. I don't know if cats have Down syndrome, but a cat with Down syndrome that has different chromosome structure than a normal cat. What is a cat? Well, we kind of generally know what we think of as a cat, and anything that loosely meets that definition, it doesn't have to be exact on the dot. That's how language functions. It doesn't function with the hard and fast absolutes. We just make generalities. As long as we all understand that that's what we're operating on, and we're not operating on hard and fast truths, then we could agree to get along.
Yeah, the funny thing about these questions of whether they're hard and fast truths is that you're actually just bringing up the argument between Plato and Aristotle about Platonic forms. Plato is someone who says that a cat is a concept, is a form that has its own sort of inherent existence outside of human experience. Whereas Aristotle is saying that a cat is more of a concept that you created as a collection of your experiences, and therefore that's one of the reasons that it's inherently fuzzy. Plato says that the fuzziness is something that the material world will pervert. Aristotle is just saying, no, it's because you never had a really fine definition of some things in the first place. They're meant to be a little more flexible as a way to incorporate most of experience, and that's one of the reasons that language changes, it adapts and evolves.
Yeah, you probably didn't listen to the episode, but afterwards, Dale Tuggy, he didn't like me calling him a Platonist because he was using Plato's theory of the forms to define self. Yeah. Remember, he's a Unitarian, and he stated that any being with 2 different wills is not one being. And I said, well, really? Because I used the example of Multiple Man from X-Men. I always considered this Multiple Man who could split into multiple people, I always considered him one person. And that's a pretty general idea, as we saw from in that actual episode. You probably did see it, so you probably don't know what I'm referring to. Someone did Star Trek transporter question. If you step into a Star Trek transporter, your molecules are broken down, you teleport to somewhere else in space, and it's built up again. But both you step out of the original transporter and out of that remote transporter. Are there two yous and one you? Are there two yous or one you? And most everyone said there's both of them are you.
Most everyone
who is voting. It was like 5,000 votes.
Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that, but
well, you wouldn't. But the fact is that a large majority of people would say that both those people are the same people. That's their concept of what it means to be self.
Yeah,
and so that just demonstrates the looseness of these concepts and these ideas, that you don't have a hard and fast definition that you could go to. And there's going to be disagreement whether or not we agree with their actual answer or not. But anyways, this episode's going fairly long. We'll have to cut it down a little bit. To last questions, is metaphysics a thing, or is it just nonsense?
Well, I'm a little confused with the people mean different things when they say metaphysics, because metaphysics seems to mean just ontology, which is a field of philosophy. Yeah, here's a definite. This is the funniest thing. So you look at this. This is the definition of metaphysics according to Wikipedia: a branch of philosophy that deals in first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, substance, cause, identity, time, and space. Those are all valid questions to ask in philosophy, and you can put those together and call it a discipline, right? And then the very next thing they say, abstract theory with no basis in realities. And that's just sort of the snide response that people have when they hear the word metaphysics, because it's not as sophisticated as using a word like ontology.
So I'll tell you what I think when I hear metaphysics. When I hear metaphysics, I think of people engaging in dignum Deo theology. What would make God the best God? And then they say, well, a God who changes wouldn't be the best God. And so what we posit is that God cannot change in any sense. A God with dependencies is not the best God. And so God who exists must exist without dependencies. Oh, by the way, they say, God must exist because the definition of God is the greatest being imaginable, and a God that exists is better than a God who just doesn't exist. Therefore, God exists by definition. And so, in that sense, metaphysics being dignum Deo philosophy, I would tend to say that there is no basis in reality.
Well, right. And so that's the whole problem, is that what does the word metaphysics mean?
Yeah, what does it mean? Well, that you heard it from our resident physicist, John Fisher. All right, questions or comments? Start a thread on God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.